South Africans are waking up to revised COVID-19 regulations today. Most notably, the wearing of face masks indoors and restrictions on gatherings will remain in place. However, the mask mandate is no longer applicable for school children. Let's get you a sense of what you should be thinking about with these new regulations. Bring in Professor Shabir Madhi, who's a Professor of Vaccinology at Wits University. Prof, it's always great to have you on the program. Thanks indeed for making time. Let me begin just with the timing of these regulations, released literally at the 11th hour. People already suggesting that this shows that government has been napping on this. Is that also your view?
Certainly, and there's nothing new about these regulations other than the issue of not wearing masks in schools. And essentially what we've been presented to us is a rehash of what has existed, which is completely unfit for purpose. And it's further exacerbated now with internal contradictions in these regulations. It makes absolutely no sense. The best way to describe it is being simply stupid.
Wow, okay. That's a great start, I guess. What I find most interesting is these restrictions around travel, right? We are already in a situation where certain countries have lifted all entry restrictions or requirements, as it were. In that world, does it still make sense to be having restrictions in place into South Africa? Because we do know that if there's any kind of lapse anywhere in the world, it affects where COVID goes anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, all of these regulations sort of still have a mindset that we're trying to prevent infections from transpiring in a country, which is not the case. Having international travelers require PCR to enter into the country simply doesn't make sense when at the time of the resurgence, at the peak of the resurgence, 1 out of every 3 people in South Africa probably are infected with the virus. Getting a handful of international travelers that might be infected that come into the country with a virus is completely meaningless in terms of the trajectory of the pandemic. And then they've got exceptions for people that do regular travel from neighboring countries that they don't require PCR. Again, completely filled with contradictions. Because what, if anything, what's been shown in during the course of the past 2 years is that people in Africa had the highest infection rate throughout the world. Our positivity rate across the continent before the onset of Omicron was 79%. So people from neighboring countries that are regularly visiting South Africa, they don't require PCR tests, whilst international travelers that are vaccinated do require a PCR test, is completely nonsensical and simply oblivious to the impact that would have in terms of putting people off from traveling in South Africa when we're needing to open up and start reviving our economy.
Is there anything from these revised regulations, as far as you're concerned, Prof, that does make sense?
Absolutely nothing.
All right.
I simply stated absolutely nothing because it's underpinned with a notion that we're still trying to prevent infections when the rest of the world has pretty much moved on, except for countries such as China, which still aspire to a zero-COVID game.
Right, and we obviously don't have that aspiration, probably because it's completely out of reach. It does raise the question about the level of consultation that's taking place between government and some of your colleagues, if any. What do you know about the processes that government still undergoes before releasing things like these revised rules?
Well, government seems to be completely oblivious to the advice that it gets from its own ministerial advisory committee. 2-3 months ago, they released a whole lot of advisories from the committee, which basically argued against all of these regulations. The committee itself argued that they should stop doing PCR tests of international travelers. The committees itself argued that they should stop having restrictions on outdoor gatherings. And those are the advice that the minister's own advisory committee gave to the Department of Health, and they simply have ignored it. So unfortunately, whoever's coming up with these regulations is doing nothing more than a thumbsuck, and is completely ignorant as to what COVID is all about, where we are in the pandemic, and what actually needs to be done in a country such as South Africa. It's an embarrassment.
What becomes then the appropriate response to where we are? Because, I mean, one thing that is still unequivocally clear is that the virus is still with us. In fact, we are seeing an uptick in the numbers. What ought to be the response to that trend?
And the virus is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So we should stop pretending that the virus is going to go away by extending regulations for another 3 months. The main focus in South Africa, which government again is failing at, is to get more than 90% of people above the age of 50 vaccinated. It's not about trying to stop people from being infected. We failed in that dismally. We will continue failing in doing so. What we need to do is minimize the number of people that end up in hospital and die of COVID-19. And right now, the only way that we can do it is to maximize protection of people, especially above the age of 50, and those with underlying medical conditions. We need to get more than 90% of them vaccinated. That is a goal that government set to have completed in July of last year. 1 year later, we still only have 2/3 of people above the age of 50 that have been vaccinated. So unfortunately, government is coming up with regulations somewhat to mask its inability to meet its own targets and essentially a failure on the part of public health to do what is required most at this point in time, and that is to maximize protection against hospitalization and death.
So to be clear, as far as you're concerned, there's no need for any kind of restriction to stave off a worst-case scenario because of the pandemic?
No, it's a pretense that you can actually prevent infections within a South African context. If that happened, if we were successful in doing that, we wouldn't have had more than 85% of people infected at least once since the start of the pandemic. During the Omicron wave alone, we estimate that 30 to 40% of people in South Africa were actually infected just during that wave. And before that, 75% of South Africans had been infected at least once. So any regulations that still have a mindset of trying to prevent infections, especially with tools that aren't actually fit for purpose, wearing a cloth mask does not protect you from being infected. It doesn't reduce the chances of you transmitting the virus. In fact, these cloth masks, which probably haven't been washed for more than a year, are now beginning to probably pose a health risk of its own. So, simply stated, there's complete incoherence in terms of our strategy, if there is a strategy at all, because I don't think government has got a strategy as to what it's trying to achieve with these regulations, because it's certainly not about preventing infections, although it seems that they pretend that we're still trying to prevent infections from transpiring.
It's an interesting statement, that, because initially we were told that there is an impact that face masks actually have. Are you suggesting we've always had it wrong, or it's just no longer necessary now?
Well, unfortunately, what we've learned, especially with viruses that is more transmissible, variants that are more transmissible, is that those face masks, cloth masks, unfortunately don't do much. Firstly, they don't filter enough of the microparticles out or prevent it from being exhaled into the environment. Secondly, the fit of those face masks is that it leaves gaps around your nose, around your mouth. If you're wanting to protect yourself, and I'm saying that high-risk individuals, especially when there's a resurgence, they should actually wear a face mask when indoors, but they need to wear the right type of face mask. And that is what we refer to as the N95 face mask or a KN95 face mask, and it needs to be worn correctly. These are face masks that probably cost about 40, 50 rand per mask, and you can't use it probably more than 2 to 3 times. But you need to wear the right type of face mask and wear it correctly if you're wanting to protect yourself or prevent yourself from releasing the virus into the environment. The type of face mask that 99% of South Africans wear, of the few that still continue wearing it, that is, simply is not fit for purpose in protecting an individual or preventing you from transmitting the virus in the environment.
A lot of attention from the Health Department's briefing last week Friday was around whether or not technically we're now in a fifth wave. The sense I'm getting from you is that that's even the wrong question to ask, because infections will continue to happen. What is interesting to me, though, is still that there's still conversations around the possibility of more variants emerging. In a context where we don't know how these variants will respond to vaccines, is there room of thinking about ways of restricting infections in the future?
No. Yeah, the answer is no. So the type of variants that have evolved up to now, including the BA4 that's currently dominating South Africa, pretty much is able to evade what we refer to the antibody that's induced by past infection as well as by vaccines, which means that people are not adequately protected against infection and mild COVID. But these mutations haven't been able to sort of circumvent that part of the immune system which protects us against severe disease and death. The chances of such a variant evolving that is able to evade what we refer to as T-cell immunity, the chances of such a variant evolving is extremely low. And if it does transpire, then we're going back to square number one. We're going back to March 2020, and we need to relook the entire scene in terms of what we're wanting to do. But right now, pretending that yes, there's going to be further variants. Without any question, there's going to be further variants. But it's highly unlikely that those future variants are going to be able to evade the T-cell immunity. And if it does, pretty much it renders all of these vaccines that we're currently using completely useless. And we're basically back to square one.
Speaking about immunity, there were still questions last time I checked about how long immunity from natural infection and vaccines actually last. In what ways should that also respond our response to this, or inform our response to this?
Well, it depends what you're trying to protect against. If you're trying to protect against infections, then unfortunately immunity either from vaccines or from past infection probably doesn't last for 2 months, and perhaps sometimes even less so when there's a new variant that arises that's antibody evasive. But if you're trying to protect against severe disease and death, for the average person, that immunity probably lasts for for more than a year. And unfortunately, we've got underlying medical conditions. Then you need to get additional boosters, up to 3 to 4 doses of vaccine. And then your protection against severe disease would go up to around about 90% as well. So it depends what we're trying to protect against. If we're pretending that we're successful in preventing infections from vaccines or past infection, unfortunately, the news flash is that we don't have the tools to do that. But we have tools that work extremely well in protecting against severe disease and death. And that is vaccines, including people that have been previously infected. When they receive a vaccine, what we refer to as hybrid immunity, they probably have the best type of protection, both against severe disease as well as against infection and mild COVID.
So, again, to be clear, I presume what you're saying is that you envision a future where there aren't necessarily restrictions in the form that we have them now, but there is a culture of continuous vaccination, at the very least to prevent severe disease.
Well, there would need to be a culture of continuous vaccination, at least for high-risk individuals. I don't think every other South African would need to get a booster dose annually unless we get a different type of vaccine that is much more resilient in protecting against infection and mild COVID. But for high-risk individuals, I suspect we probably would want to boost them almost annually, really to enhance the protection against severe disease and death. The average 20, 25-year-old is not at risk, substantial risk of developing severe disease. And once vaccinated, that risk becomes minuscule, and it's probably long-lasting in terms of protection after vaccination. So, again, the focus is about hospitalization and death, and we need to optimize protection of high-risk individuals.
Strong words, but really insightful insights. Professor Shabir Madhi, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. I appreciate your time on this Thursday morning. There you have it. Professor Madhi is a vaccinologist with Wits University who believes that none of these revised restrictions, at least in their current form, make any sense given where we are with the pandemic.